Most of us know or think that we know at least a bare-bones story of the Alamo. A relatively small number of Texians and a few Tejanos attempt to defend an abandoned Spanish mission against Santa Anna's much larger force. After a 13-day siege, all of the combatants inside the walls perish, and, well, that is the story of the Alamo siege in a nutshell. But the siege story, like all stories, is a human story. So we're going to unfurl the story of the siege day by day from the perspectives of a few of the people who were there and survived. This is by no means an exhaustive analysis of the siege. It's like a 10-minute video. There are books for that we'll link to below. I'd prefer you think of this as an introduction to life in and around the Alamo before the date we all remember, March 6th, 1836. And we start now. In 1836, San Antonio wasn't swarming with tourists like it is today, but it was and it had been the largest population center in Mexican Texas. There were about 2,400 souls living in the Department of Bexar in the mid-1830s. Most of the Texians and the Tejanos who garrisoned the Alamo did not live within its walls. Some lived in town on the opposite side of the San Antonio River, others lived in La Villita, still others lived on ranchos outside of town. Now, on the morning of February 23rd, the first day of the siege, most of the soon-to-be defenders awakened to the sound of ox carts groaning under the weight of the personal possessions of the residents of San Antonio because they were all leaving in a hurry. Those who didn't have carts carried what they could in their arms and were getting the heck out of town. The Alamo's co-commander, William Barrett Travis, more than likely a little hungover and sleep-deprived because there had been a fandango the night before, well, he went out to learn what the townspeople were up to. What did they know that he didn't know? What he found was that the locals weren't especially chatty as they tried to flee. Nobody would tell him anything. According to Dr. John Sutherland, physician to the Alamo garrison, eventually a friendly Bejareño told Travis that Santa Anna and his cavalry had arrived the night before and were down on Leon Creek about 8 miles from San Antonio. A dawn attack had been planned, but nothing had happened. It had rained something wicked for the last 2 nights, muddying up the roads and the terrain around San Antonio. This made travel slow, and it screwed with Santa Anna's plans for a surprise dawn attack that was supposed to be carried out by General Sesma. But when the Napoleon of the West arrived with his main army at 9 or 10 in the morning, he was quite surprised to see that no attack had been made at all. The mud had bought the Texians more time. In light of the recent news, Travis, Dr. Sutherland, and one other man rode out to the San Fernando Church, what we now call the San Fernando Cathedral, and they climbed up on the roof to see if they could spy the Mexican army. But they saw nothing. So Sutherland and Travis climbed on down, but they left a sentinel posted with instructions to ring the San Fernando bell the instant a sighting was made. According to Colonel Juan Almonte and according to Pablo Diaz, a young carpenter who watched all the events unfold from the roof of Mission Concepcion, the Texians hoisted a flag up the pole in the Plaza de Armas, the military plaza. But it wasn't the Lone Star flag. It was the Mexican tricolor flag, yet in the center, no eagle was to be found. Instead, there were 2 stars designed to represent the separate states of Coahuila and Texas. Around noon, the bell rang out and the sentinel shouted, "The enemy are in view!" Everything was chaos. Was it true? Was it infantry? Was it cavalry? Both? How many of each? Dr. Sutherland and John W. Smith rode out to reconnoiter. As the 2 men came up on a rise just west of town, they saw what the sentinel had merely caught a glimpse of: Sesma's brigade of about 1,500 men. The Jimenez, Matamoros, and Morales battalions, the Dolores Regiment, and 62 artillerists comprised the brigade. Through the mud, they had been hauling 6 cannon and 2 7-inch howitzers. Now, Sutherland and Smith had seen everything they needed to see, and they wheeled around to start back to town. About 50 yards on, though, the mud got the better of Sutherland's horse. The animal lost its footing and halted, pitching Sutherland in one direction and his gun in the other. Horse fell on top of rider, and they both just lie there stunned for a minute, until Smith dismounted, helping Sutherland and his horse both to their feet. Back at Plaza de Armas, the tricolor flag was taken down, and Travis moved the entire Texian force, then about 150 men, into the walls of the Alamo. John Sutherland met up with David Crockett, and together they went to the room where Travis had his headquarters. Here, on the west wall, sort of near where Ripley's used to be, and soon to be part of the new Alamo Museum. Smith, for his part, went to the home of the Esparza family on Flores Street. His plan was to send the Esparzas along with his own family away as soon as a wagon arrived. But according to Enrique Esparza, who was just a boy at the time of the siege, that wagon never came. So Smith advised Enrique's father, Gregorio, to do the next best thing and to stash his family inside the Alamo compound. So the Esparza family went to gather whatever worldly possessions they could haul from home. Meanwhile, back at the West Wall, Sutherland and David Crockett presented themselves to Travis to ask where he wanted them to be for what was about to go down. Sutherland, his gun and his knee injured from the equestrian slip-and-slide accident, was sent to Gonzales to raise reinforcements. According to Sutherland, Crockett said, "Assign me to a position and I and my 12 boys will try to defend it." Travis told him to post up at the picket wall, from the end of the barrack here to the corner of the church on the south side. Now back on the other side of the San Antonio River near San Fernando Church, Susanna Dickinson waited with her baby, Angelina, at the home of Ramon Musquiz. Her artillerist husband, Almiron, sped in on his horse, scooped them up, and managed to stay ahead of the advancing Mexican soldados who were entering the town. He arrived at the Alamo and installed Susanna and Angelina in the sacristy of the Alamo Church and said his goodbyes. By 2 p.m., Santa Anna's troops were marching through Main Plaza, and by 3 p.m., Santa Anna wrote that the city was his. In his officers' quarters, Travis penned 2 letters on the first day of the siege. The first was to James Fannin in Goliad asking for assistance. He said, "I have about 146 men and enough provisions to survive until you and your men get here." Travis also wrote to Gonzales with a similar appeal. It just so happened that the problem of provisions was solved on this day. About 30 head of cattle being driven down Commerce Street was herded into the pens near the Alamo Church. They had belonged to Ignacio Perez, and Travis issued Perez a receipt for the beeves, an IOU pay you later kind of thing. Spoiler alert, Travis would not be able to pay him later for those beeves, but Francisco Ruiz would reimburse Mr. Perez on Travis's behalf for the cattle later on. From abandoned jacales near the Alamo, nearly 100 bushels of corn were cobbled together. Along with the beef, this would feed the men, women, and children inside the walls of the Alamo for the duration of the siege. And Travis would write about this caloric windfall in his famous victory or death letter the following day. Now, I guess it's a good time to mention that the Alamo was not built to be a fort. It was a mission. A fort is, well, a fortification, a fortified military settlement. A mission is a religious settlement. A fort was often built near a mission by the Spanish to offer the mission protection, as we see in Goliad. So the Alamo wasn't built with portholes in its walls to fire through. It lacked bastions and gun emplacements, all these handy things you find in fort architecture that allow you to defend a place while maintaining some cover, so you don't have to stand and defend a wall and risk being shot in the head. Well, the Alamo ceased to be a mission, that is, a religious settlement, in 1793. It was secularized. A decade later, Spanish troops occupied the compound, and to make it more defensible, they added a fortified lunette around the south gate to the compound. This area, which served as the convento when the compound was a mission, the Spanish soldiers turned into a barrack. Today, we call it the Long Barrack. And yes, singular is correct. Single barrack is singular, and multiple buildings are multiple barracks. And it is the oldest structure in Alamo Plaza, about 20 years older than the church. After Mexico gained her independence from Spain in 1821, the Spanish troops, well, they left. The next military occupant of the Alamo was Mexican General Martin Perfecto de Cos, who was sent to Texas in the fall of 1835 to try to nip a rebellion in the bud. While Cos was there, he and his troops beefed up the Alamo a little bit more. Well, as we know, things absolutely did not calm down in Texas. Texians and Tejanos, who were sick and tired of Santa Anna's BS, lay siege to San Antonio for the better part of 2 months, culminating in an assault on the town by the Texians in December 1835 that involved some pretty insane house-to-house, hand-to-hand combat that lasted 5 days. When Coe surrendered and left the building, so to speak, the Texians kept San Antonio, they kept the Alamo, and they kept much of Mexican equipment and arms. They kept some cannon, too. Now, fast forward just 2 months, and you have Santa Anna laying siege to take it all back. Young Enrique Esparza and his family were not yet inside the Alamo when Santa Anna raised a flag on the belfry of San Fernando Church. The flag could be easily discerned from the Alamo, 1,000 yards away, because it was blood red. You'd have to be blind to miss it. It was the flag of no quarter. As Enrique Esparza later said, it meant death to every man within the Alamo who so defied Santa Anna. The flag of no quarter was answered with a shot toward town from the 18-pounder, the cannon located here, the largest in the Alamo. According to one Mexican officer, the response to the Alamo cannon shot was 4 exploding projectiles from the 2 7-inch howitzers. Santa Anna recorded that the shot from the 18-pounder killed 1 corporal and 1 cazador and wounded 8 more men. The howitzer grenades harmed no one that we know of. Amidst this brief artillery exchange, the Esparza family was making its way to the Alamo. James Boddie, who had been ill with a respiratory illness for much of February, probably tuberculosis, was still upright at this time. And as co-commander of the Alamo garrison, he sent Green B. Jameson as a messenger out with a note for Santa Anna. Juan Almonte was sent to talk with Jameson. The note was pretty simple and likely written in Spanish, and I'll summarize it for you. Hey, we fired a cannon shot when you hoisted that flag of no quarter, so it was kind of noisy. Some of my friends say they think you sounded a parlay. Did you sound a parlay? We're pretty curious about that parlay. So it's not an offensive note, right? Well, officers on both sides of the San Antonio River and of the conflict didn't like it. Mexican officers took umbrage to the fact that it was addressed from the commander of the volunteers of Bear to the commander of the invading forces below Bear. Yikes. And to rub some salt and lime in that wound, Bowie signed off on his note, God and Texas. Travis may have written the most stirring letter of the siege, but Bowie definitely issued the sickest burn. William Barrett Travis didn't much appreciate that Bowie unilaterally sent the note at all, so he sent his own messenger, in the guise of Albert Martin, to inform Santa Anna's officers that if they wanted to come talk with him mano a mano, he'd be happy to chat. What the commanders of the Alamo suggested was reciprocity. When Coase had surrendered, they let him leave alive. And Coase wasn't the only example. So they were saying, look, if you'll do us an in-kind solid, we might surrender. But Santa Anna wasn't having it, and through his officers, he said, yeah, no, we don't negotiate with bandits and rebels, so if you surrender, it's up to us what we do with you. According to Mexican officer Jose Enrique de la Peña, Travis chose the path that strong souls should choose in a crisis, that of dying with honor, and he selected the Alamo for his grave. At dusk on the 23rd of February, the Esparza family finally arrived at the gates of the Alamo, only to find everything was locked down. Enrique's mother furiously pounded on the doors until a sentinel recognized Gregorio Esparza as a friendly face, and the family of 6 was directed around back to a window into the church, probably about 7 feet from the ground. Once the Esparza family were piled in, along with all their worldly possessions, the window was secured and the Alamo was locked down. The sun set on February 23rd, 1836. The Alamo was under siege, peopled by about 150 or so effective men, Tejanos and Texians. A handful of women, a handful of children, a couple of babies. They were stowed away in the sacristy, where they had the best chance of survival. And why the sacristy? Well, for starters, it had a roof, which is a pretty vital component that the rest of the church lacked. A roof is kinda helpful when projectiles are flying and falling and stuff is exploding. That's the practical reason. Philosophically speaking, it makes sense too. The word sacristy literally means repository for sacred things. Where else would you put your women and children? That night, the Mexican troops set up a second artillery battery. They slept on their arms, ready to rise up and fight at any moment if the time for the final assault came. A huge thank you to Mr. James Boddie for permission to use his CGI renderings of the Alamo as it appeared in 1836. The primary reference used in this series is Colonel Alan Huffine's excellent book, The Blood of Noble Men. Links to it and other Alamo references are down below in the video description. Until day 2 of the siege, God in Texas, y'all.